I'm going to hit the go live button right now. And it appears that we are live. Welcome, 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 one and all. My name is James Halifax from the Psychedelic Investor, and I am extremely excited to welcome you all today to the Psychedelic CEO Roundtable. And it is my absolute pleasure to be welcomed by the CEO of MindMed, Mr. Robert Barrow, the CEO of Cybin, Mr. Doug Drysdale, and the Executive Chairman of Field Trip Health, Mr. Ronan Levy. So in today's presentation, hopefully we will get to learn more about each of these companies, where the industry will be going in the next coming years, and just learn about psychedelic medicines more in general. But first, I would like to say a couple words about our partner Fireside Project. Let's see if I can get them up on the screen here for us. I can't seem to be able to do that, so it's fine. A couple words about our partner, Fireside Project. They are a psychedelic peer support line that offers free, confidential peer support by phone and text message to people in the midst of a psychedelic experience. The Psychedelic Peer Support Line is staffed by compassionate, supportive volunteers from diverse backgrounds who are trained to deeply listen from a place of non-judgment. Fireside does absolutely fantastic work, and if anybody is ever in a situation where they need to talk to somebody while undergoing a psychedelic experience, I highly suggest giving them a call. Alrighty, so now let's hop into the content of the discussion itself, the Psychedelic CEO Roundtable. And I see that Ronan Levy is on my screen here, so why don't we start with you, Mr. Levy? Why don't you give us a couple of minutes to talk about who you are, who Field Trip Health is, and maybe explain what makes the company unique within the ever-growing and ever more crowded psychedelics landscape.
Sure. Thanks, James. My name is Ronan Levy. I'm one of the co-founders and the executive chairman of Field Trip. What makes Field Trip unique in the psychedelic industry, I think, is two primary factors. The first is that we've adopted an integrated model. In most cases, when you talk about psychedelics, what we're talking about is psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So it's using the psychedelic molecules paired with a psychotherapeutic protocol that leads to some of these outcomes that we're seeing that are so transformative, whether it's the MAPS MDMA-assisted therapy protocols, whether it's the psilocybin-assisted therapy protocols. It is the drug with the therapy that seems to generate these super outcomes. And so when we created Field Trip, we realized that if you're focused only on developing new psychedelic molecules without also iterating and innovating on the psychotherapeutic protocols that go with it, you're leaving an essential component of the overall therapeutic to third parties. It's outside of your control. And so we wanted to make sure that as we were developing our therapeutics, we had a handle on both sides of the equation. And so as a result, Field Trip has two divisions. We have Field Trip Health, which is building out the clinical centers to deliver psychedelic-assisted therapy. We have 12 locations right now working with ketamine-assisted therapy, which is great because we're building a revenue base, we're building a referral base, we're establishing an understanding of what the best protocols are, how to deliver them efficiently, as well as starting to integrate with the local medical communities to raise awareness for psychedelic-assisted therapies. On the other side, we have our Field Trip Discovery division, which is generating new psychedelic molecules to work. In development is a molecule called FT104. FT104 is a prodrug of the psychedelic molecule 4-HO-DIPT, which for anyone who's familiar with Alex Shulgin, was one of his favorite psychedelic molecules. And what makes FT104 so exciting is that it is a short-acting psychedelic molecule, so it's about 2 to 3 hours, whereas with psilocybin or MDMA conventionally, you're talking about much longer experiences. So from a clinical efficiency perspective, FT104 is going to be preferable to some of the classic psychedelics. And because it's a prodrug, we've improved the solubility and stability of it relative to 4-HO-DIPT. So it's going to be a better medicine relative to the classic psychedelic 4-HO-DIPT. So with FT104, we think we've got a molecule that really delivers a great quality experience, will generate the therapeutic outcomes that we see with the classic psychedelics, but in a much truncated experience, which we think is going to make it more efficient. In our pipeline, we're working on the FT200 series as well, which is a class of molecules that have all the 5-HT2 agonism of the classic psychedelics, but have improved selectivity relative to the 5-HT2B liability or 5-HT2B receptor, which is important because one of the things we don't talk about yet very much in this industry is something called the liability, which is if you agonize the 2B receptor, it does create potential cardiac issues in the future over time. So focusing on molecules that have lower engagement with the 2B receptor is something that is going to be well suited for kind of more chronic administration, microdosing kind of molecules as well, because it addresses one of the potential concerns around chronic use of psychedelics. So that's Field Trip. I think I took too much time saying that, so I apologize to Doug and Robert, but that's Field Trip in a sort of brief nutshell.
No worries. And now, Mr. Robert Barrow, could you maybe talk about who you are, who MindMed is, what your goals are, and what sets you apart in the crowded psychedelic medicines field?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, James. So I think when you look at MindMed and you look at who we are as an organization, we're an organization that's built on over 30 years of research with some of the compounds we're studying, and obviously many more decades of research on the classic psychedelics that we're leveraging into really accelerated, efficient drug development programs. We are a pharmaceutical company that is seeking to build a powerhouse CNS-focused drug company, taking products from building out a pipeline and taking them through an approval process, both here in the US and throughout the world, to bring these new therapies to the market to improve patient outcomes and effectively deliver the tools to the physicians that they can go out and deliver to improve mental health outcomes. We have a broad clinical pipeline, 2 programs, LSD and a molecule called 18MC that we're going to phase 2 clinical trials of imminently. Again, building on decades of research, both internally from predecessor organization that was funded by a $6.5 million NIDA grant back from 2013 to work on 18MC, and on the many decades of research for LSD. And so as we've built our organization, it's really focused to become a competitive drug company in the CNS space. And psychedelics offer an incredible opportunity to improve patient outcomes, to realize the therapeutic potential of all that we've seen in preliminary data in the academic literature. But we're not stopping there. We're thinking many generations beyond that, both with other molecules that may have psychoactive properties and a whole pipeline of molecules that very well may not. We're somewhat agnostic to whether drugs have perceptual effects as long as they improve patient outcomes. That's our core focus.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Doug Drysdale, could you walk us through quickly who you are, who Cybin is, and what sets your company apart?
Yeah, good morning, James, and thanks for having us on the show today. Yeah, at Cybin, we're looking to engineer, simply put, psychedelics into therapeutics, and we're doing that by developing derivatives and analogs of psilocybin and DMT and MDMA, with the goal to overcome many of the known limitations of these molecules. Many of those limitations potentially hurdles to approval. So our goal is to develop approvable, prescribable therapeutics for mental health conditions such as depression, addiction, and anxiety disorders. And we've got 4 sponsored clinical studies coming up this year. But it goes beyond just the molecule. So in addition to working on these novel treatments, we're also at the same time working to tackle a number of the other challenges around these treatments, such as optimizing the psychological support alongside these molecules, extending the durability of effect through looking at different dosing regimens. I mean, ultimately, we think the durability is the major paradigm shift here. But also at the same time, working to overcome the stigma and misinformation surrounding psychedelics, educating the population, and improving mental health awareness.
Fantastic. So it appears that we are having a little bit of an audio problem at the moment, so I would just like to ask anybody that is listening to this, and by the way, we have a lot of concurrent viewers at the moment. We've got several hundred concurrent viewers. So if everybody is hearing everybody fine, just leave a like in the chat. Elsewise, I'd like to just say that while we are discussing today, you guys can go ahead and leave some questions in the comments. At the end of this conference, we will ask questions from the audience to the 3 CEOs. All right, so let's get into the first discussion of the day, which is next generation psychedelics. So some of you already commented on next generation psychedelics a little bit. So I was wondering if you could discuss amongst yourselves if in the future, if you believe that psychedelic therapy will be completely dominated by new compounds, or will traditional psychedelics still play a role in a therapy setting?
I'll start us off very briefly just to say that I think there's a huge unmet need in treating psychiatric and other brain disorders. It's not going to be a one size fits all solution. There's not going to be one molecule that cures every patient, and that's an unreasonable expectation for any therapy. So as we look at the opportunity here, again, I think we can think of what can get to the market the fastest. Drugs that have been well characterized or well understood, they're likely to have the fastest path to a market because they've already been so de-risked. Beyond that, there's going to be many generations and hopefully decades of discovery that are built on what we're working on right now that are going to shepherd in a whole new era of new molecules. I think we'll see a resurgence in new therapies to treat brain disorders. But it isn't going to be one or the other. It's going to have to be a combination of both, at least in our view.
And Ronan, do you agree?
Yeah, I think that's generally correct. I mean, certainly what we're going to see in the shorter term is the classic psychedelics like psilocybin and MDMA are going to be the first to be approved. There's no doubt about that. And they're going to create incredible impact. I am also quite confident about that. I do agree with Robert that it's not a one size fits all approach, that there are going to be some people who lean into having the experience as part of the outcome, having the full psychedelic trip, for lack of a better term, as part of the process and all of the subjective effects that go with it, along with the objective ones. And then there's other people who are going to look for more classic medicines where you take the drug or the pill and there's no psychoactive or psychotropic effect. And it's going to work well, and that's the outcome that they want. So it's definitely going to be I think there are going to be a lot of options for a lot of different people. Do I think the next generation psychedelics will be predominant? I do in the future. I think going ahead 5-10 years, you'll see next generation psychedelics start to displace the classic psychedelics for two primary reasons. One is, as we've alluded to, the time associated with an MDMA or a psilocybin or an LSD experience tends to be quite long. And therefore it is both expensive as well as significant opportunity cost to spend that much time in the clinic. Again, some people will opt for that. But if you can find molecules that have shorter duration of effect without impacting the therapeutic outcomes, then I think most people would choose to do it in half the time if they could. And I think that's what you'll see with the classic, the next generation psychedelics. I also think the next generation psychedelics are going to address some of the limitations with the classic psychedelics. Again, as mentioned with our FT200 series, if you can address the 2B liability, there's a lot of interest certainly. And I think MindMed, and sorry if I'm speaking out of turn, but
Could you
I think one of
perhaps
MindMed
just
studies.
explain what that is, the 2B liability?
Sure. If you agonize the 5-HT, so it's believed that the effect of psychedelics and their therapeutic outcomes come from the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor, and that creates the psychedelic experience classically known. There are a number of serotonin receptors throughout the body. The 5-HT2B has been shown that if it gets agonized too much, it can create a potential risk for cardiac valvulopathy, which basically means cardiac valve hardening. And so when you look at people, if they chronically use psychedelics, and there's a potential risk of this 2B liability, this cardiac valvulopathy. And so it's not necessarily a severe risk, but certainly when we talk about medicines that are going to be administered chronically, and if we're talking about depression, which in many cases is a lifelong consideration, then minimizing that risk is something that I think is going to be valued. And so, like I said, with our 200 series, we're working to address that potential risk. Again, it just makes for better medicines that are more sustainable for longer term duration. And so I think these are the two aspects that we're focused on with our next generation psychedelics. There are certainly going to be more tailored experience, more precise experiences for particular populations. There's any number of possibilities and ways to improve upon the classic psychedelics. Not that they're necessarily bad or there should be any concerns or negatives associated with them, but it doesn't mean it can't get better. And so that's why I do believe in the future for the medical applications of psychedelics, it's going to be next generation. I think we're going to see a whole bunch of state-by-state, jurisdiction-by-jurisdiction therapy programs or access programs like we're seeing in Oregon start to roll out. And those are going to work with the classic psychedelics almost certainly. But for a medical application, I do believe next generation molecules will eventually become predominant.
And what do you
I
think?
want to, can I jump in real quick? I want to make just a quick comment about 2B liability, which I know we all try to differentiate our products, but I think it's important to highlight the fact that there's actually a pretty substantial body of evidence that chronic agonist activity at 2B. So if you administer a serotonin 2B agonist for many, many months, and it's typically like 6 to 9 months, and there's a high incidence of cardiovasculopathy. That's not true if you chronically intermittently administer it. And so one-off administration several times is very different pharmacologically than hitting a receptor and sitting on that receptor every day forever. And that's what you see with most of the historical liabilities here. So yeah, there is certainly, we're still characterizing fully the safety and effectiveness of these molecules. That's what you have to do to get new drugs approved. But I do think it's worth highlighting that across any of the classic psychedelics, we have not seen acute use associated with any sort of cardiac liability.
Yeah, maybe take that a little bit further to say that it's one thing to get approved, but I think an equally as big a hurdle is reimbursement. And reimbursement equals patient access, and that's really what we've been focused on. So although we've talked about duration of the treatment as being a hurdle, it's only a piece of the puzzle. At the end of the day, you want reimbursement so that there can be maximized adoption. So side effects, as these guys are talking about, certainly come into that reimbursement profile, right, the adoption profile. But I think, quite honestly, that the biggest impact will be from durability. And I think that's the biggest paradigm shift compared to SSRI. So to move from chronic treatment to an intermittent treatment that has benefits the last weeks or months, it's really the big paradigm shift we're talking about with psychedelics. So I think our goal needs to be to optimize the profile of these treatments, whether it's duration of the treatment itself. The side effect profile, of course, is always important with any pharmaceutical, but optimizing both the psychological support and the dosing regimens to maximize durability. Because these treatments take a certain amount of investment, time from the patient, time from the therapists and the treatment centers, the clinics, and that's the total cost of treatment. And we've seen that in other treatments for different conditions, such as, say, for pain, chronic pain, when patients might move from taking a daily pill to having, say, an intrathecal implant. And there's a procedure and a procedural cost that leads to months or weeks of benefit. And I think there's a parallel here. We've got to make sure that all that investment that goes into the procedures around these treatments and combined with the molecules themselves lead to a substantial durability of benefit. Otherwise, there isn't that pharmacoeconomic rationale for reimbursement. So there's a lot of aspects beyond just simply, hey, our molecule is 2 hours or 3 hours, frankly.
Awesome. And so why don't we actually drill down a little bit, and I'll give each of you the chance to talk about one of your next generation molecules. So I guess we'll start with you, Doug. Y'all actually just got a patent granted, I believe, for your CYB004, which is a version of DMT. You want to just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So our challenge with CYB4, which is a version of DMT, is kind of the opposite challenge that we have with our CYB3, which is a version of psilocybin. As you all know, DMT is very short acting. It has quite an aggressive pharmacokinetic profile, so very rapid plasma spike that goes up and down quite quickly. That's aggressive. It's probably too short for a therapeutic benefit potentially, and can lead to all sorts of anxiety and reactions from patients. So it's not something necessarily you want to take into the clinic. How can we improve on that? We can smooth out the curve, keep the patient in the therapeutic window for a little longer, extend the period of time they're in that psychedelic state, and create a treatment that's maybe creates less anxiety, but also is just more practical in terms of deployment. So that's been the challenge with CYB4, and we just received a patent for that molecule as a deuterated version of DMT. And that patent includes a number of other deuterated versions of DMT and 5-MeO DMT as well. We had the opposite challenge with CYB3, which is an analog of psilocybin. We've talked about already that psilocybin is quite long-acting. 6 or 8 hours in the clinic is pretty challenging, as we all know. So our analog of psilocybin, CYB3, which we're developing for depression, cuts up that time about in half. So it's twice as fast to onset of action, half the duration, so about half the time in the clinic. But importantly, also removes an awful lot of interpatient variability. When we look at psilocybin, in both humans and in animal models, we see quite a lot of variability in plasma levels, and that could lead to quite unpredictable outcomes. And I think the last thing you want in a new field like psychedelics and in psychiatric patients is to have results that are unpredictable. So if we can improve that safety profile, but also make the treatment as efficient as possible, and then combine that with a dosing regimen that leads to the biggest or maximizes the durability, then I think we're really looking at something more of a therapeutic than a pure play psychedelic.
Fantastic. And Mr. Robert Barrow, you guys have something called 18MC, which actually was, when I first learned about it, it was one of the impetuses for me wanting to learn more about the psychedelics industry. So I was wondering if you could just talk about 18MC for a minute.
Absolutely. So 18MC is exactly what you said, a next generation psychedelic, in the sense that it is a chemical analog, very close structurally related to the classic psychedelic known as Ibogaine. Unlike most of the classic psychedelics we know, so the psilocybins and LSDs, which we've already said have very, very small, we believe from the data we have, very, very small cardiovascular liability. Ibogaine has a pretty substantial cardiovascular liability, not because of 2B agonism, because it's a hERG channel inhibitor and leads to proarrhythmic effects. So patients can develop sudden cardiac arrhythmias that can lead to sudden death and cardiovascular emergency when they're administered Ibogaine. 18MC was optimized looking at a number of analogs, and this dates back many decades, looking at a number of analogs of Ibogaine and trying to find the one that both maintains the effectiveness, but does away with that cardiovascular liability and does away with the hallucinogenic activity of Ibogaine. That's what we have with 18MC, a non-hallucinogenic, non-proarrhythmic, so cardiovascular safe molecule. But in preclinical models we're developing 18MC for substance use disorders. In preclinical models, what we've demonstrated time and time again is that it has a similar potency as Ibogaine in reducing the amount of cocaine self-administration, opioid self-administration, alcohol, nicotine, pretty much any substance of abuse that we have tested. We've been able to show that 18MC reduces self-administration in these preclinical models. So ultimately, we just finished a phase 1 study and are now progressing into a phase 2. We're starting with the treatment of opioid withdrawal, which is one of the key areas in treating the opioid epidemic. Many patients, about half of patients, are lost just going through the withdrawal process and getting on to a longer term therapy. And so focusing on that major unmet need early in the treatment cycle, we're able to move a really rapid clinical development program and get a 7-day readout of whether we're seeing acute effects and reducing withdrawal symptoms and ultimately getting patients through withdrawal.
Fantastic. And finally, Mr. Ronan Levy, could you talk a little bit about either your FT104 series or the 200 series?
Sure, I'll pick up the conversation on the FT104. So when we set out with our drug development program, our initial focus was addressing the time duration associated with psychedelic experiences, specifically the classic psychedelics. And so with FT104, what we wanted to do strategically was find a classic psychedelic that we knew created the psychedelic effect, from the trip reports that are available and any existing clinical or academic research around it, something that we knew would offer a subjective experience similar to psilocybin, but with a shorter duration of action. And that's why we zeroed in on 4-HO-DIPT, which is a classic not a traditionally classic psychedelic. It's a synthetic psychedelic, but one that's been synthesized for a long time because it fit the criteria of an experience that is substantially similar to psilocybin. As Doug Chuck noted, DMT is a very short-acting molecule, but can be a very intense experience. With psilocybin, it tends to be a gentler experience than DMT. So we like the subjective profile of 4-HO-DIPT, as well as the duration of action, which is consistently 2 to 3 hours, as opposed to the 4 to 6 hours with psilocybin. But as a medicine, 4-HO-DIPT had some limitations in terms of its solubility, as well as its stability. And so we developed a prodrug strategy. We had our patent for FT104, as well as a broader class of psychedelic tryptamine prodrugs approved by the US Patent Office a few weeks ago, or about a month ago now. And what we have with FT104 is a molecule that fits exactly what we want, which is a very consistent plasma profile. It washes out of the blood very quickly and consistently. And that's why we've identified one of our first indications as postpartum depression. Postpartum depression is a condition that affects many new mothers, probably underreported. But one of the problems with treating postpartum depression is twofold. One is that there's only one approved drug for it right now, but that involves something like a 40 to 60 hour infusion. So a new mother has to be away from their baby for 2 to 3 days or longer to go through this treatment option. And truthfully, it seems that the effect is not, the outcomes are, it's effective, it got approved, but it's not the best outcomes that we would hope for. With using FT104 to treat postpartum depression, what we have is an experience that'll be 2 to 3 hours that washes out of the bloodstream quite quickly, and should enable a new mother to get back to their child, within a few hours as opposed to a few days. And so we think it's a really great opportunity to focus on treating a significant unmet need. We also think FT104 is going to be quite effective in the treatment-resistant depression market. Again, there's a lot of focus on psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression at this time, but we believe a product that offers a shorter duration of experience and therefore should be less expensive, both in terms of the amount of clinical resources needed to support it, as well as the opportunity cost, would be preferable to a classic psilocybin experience. And so I think there's a great opportunity to step into that. I agree with Doug's assessment that durability is an important consideration, but I think ultimately it's going to come down to the economic considerations for all of these molecules in terms of which are going to be the most successful commercially. And we feel quite confident that FT104 meets a lot of the criteria that we think would lead to commercial success with it, both for postpartum depression as well as treatment-resistant depression.
So we've heard a lot about how your different companies are modifying these molecules to make them more efficient and more effective in a treatment setting, which kind of gets us into our next topic of discussion, which is looking at what are the major barriers towards psychedelic treatment, and then specifically to the scaling process, and then how are your individual companies attempting to circumvent these scaling issues?
I'll hop in to start. One of the big scaling challenges that exists right now is that, at least with the classic psychedelic experience, set and setting matters, as well as the therapeutic protocol. And by set and setting, I mean the mindset or the preparatory work that a person brings into the psychedelic experience. This is not something that you want to go into, you just walk into a doctor's office and get administered the drug. The outcomes are better when people do preparatory psychotherapy work before the experience. And the outcomes tend to be better when it's done in a setting that is more conducive to someone feeling at ease or comfortable. So a classic doctor's office with fluorescent white lights and probably a frenetic energy is much more likely to lead to a challenging psychedelic experience, as opposed to an easy and positive one. Not that challenging psychedelic experiences are necessarily bad. Often they can lead to incredible breakthroughs for patients if properly supported. But generally speaking, if you can encourage a person to have a gentle, positive experience with psychedelics, it's going to be better overall. And so part of the reason we have our Field Trip Health division is when we looked out and we realized that MDMA-assisted therapy and psilocybin-assisted therapy are only a few years away, but that clinical infrastructure that really speaks to set and setting, as well as the therapeutic protocols, didn't exist. And so we set out to solve what would be our own problem, as well as a problem for all of the psychedelic companies out there, which is you need the spaces to deliver this kind of care. And so building that space is one of the limitations that exists right now, but it's coming. And I think you're going to see a lot of new clinical infrastructure being developed right now for ketamine-assisted therapy, but with MDMA hopefully being approved next year. Hopefully we'll see MDMA-assisted therapy start being offered through many of these settings, and then all the other molecules that the three of us are working on will be added to that list shortly, and hopefully we'll have a nice, robust offering available to patients in need.
And Mr. Doug Drysdale.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with that. Sorry to cut you off there, James. Yeah, I agree with what Ronan is saying, and there's still work to be done to optimize what that psychological support looks like. We've seen studies with skinny psychological support, less of it, and the outcomes are less impressive than those that used a fair amount of psychological support. But what's the balance from a commercial perspective? I think we've got some work to do on that still. We've developed at Cybin, as you know, James, a psychological support program called Embark. It's a 6-domain best practice psychotherapy program that we're using to train therapists and train investigators. We went through a first training at the end of last year at the University of Washington in Seattle. And we've already begun enrolling in a study there for clinical depression in frontline healthcare workers. So as we get through that study we learn about the training and the deployment and the logistics, then I think we'll be looking to find ways between now and commercialization to optimize that psychological support, finding the balance between getting the strong durability of effect and too much burden on the healthcare system. So this is a line I think we're going to have to optimize over time. And we're fortunate to have a partnership with Greenbrook TMS. They have 149 depression clinics across the US. So we've got resources and the tools, I think, to work over time to optimize the sort of standard of care, if you like, for deploying psychedelics in the future.
Perfect. And I'll give you a second in a moment, Robert, but I'd just like to give one last call out for any questions in the chat. We'll be asking those questions relatively soon. And also, we got a couple hundred people watching right now, so if you could just go ahead and hit that like button to spread this message, that would be greatly appreciated. So one last time, any questions that you have, last chance right now. Perfect. On to you, Robert.
Yeah, thanks. So I think as we look at the landscape, there's often an angle in the psychedelic community that we need to restart and rebuild from scratch the infrastructure to deliver these molecules. I think we think about it a little bit differently in that there is already a massive infrastructure for delivery of healthcare and delivery of mental health care out in the world. I mean, Doug, you just mentioned that you have a partnership with a TMS clinic with 150, and God knows there's thousands and thousands of hospitals and mental health care facilities throughout the country. Thinking about how we actually get this out at scale, these molecules at scale, is going to necessitate leveraging that ecosystem. It's not going to be possible to build 1 million treatment clinics in every city around the country, or it may be possible, but the economic burden, if you want to talk about that, it's substantial to actually build that number of clinics and staff them and have them dedicated just to one drug. It's also very unusual to think of there are ketamine clinics that are out there, but in the broader treatment landscape for brain disorders, and particularly in psychiatry, there's again already a massive infrastructure out there. It has its downsides. It would need to be upgraded, but if you need to improve roads, you don't build an entirely new road network. You need to improve the roads you already have. And so as we think about it, the real angle that we have and where we, I think, really have a furthest along, or not a comparison, but an advanced program in terms of getting these therapies to market is through digital medicine. And so we have an entire group that is dedicated to bringing forward digital medicine products that we hope to reduce that human capital burden, right? Reduce the friction to actually get these therapies. So relying on digital medicine tools to both oversee patients throughout their entire treatment life cycle, but also to provide decision support to therapists, to decision support to the providers who are ultimately going to be delivering these therapies. So we think that regardless of the duration of effect, we need to think about an entirely new model of delivering care. If we're going to say that the thing that sets psychedelics apart and this drug class apart in general is that an acute administration has a prolonged clinical benefit, which is really what is so tangibly unique about the dynamic here, then we need to think about this in more of a sort of surgical precision model where we have such a prolonged effect, we have such a significant and large effect in these patients that it warrants coming in for 2 or 3 or 6 or 12 hours. If you need to go get your knee replaced, there's a high cost to it, but the duration of that benefit is so substantial that the economics work out pretty favorably. And so we need to rethink. This is certainly not going to be a model where you're going into a standard exam room and given psilocybin or LSD and told we'll see you in 12 hours. There's going to need to be a sort of an uplift of the delivery landscape. But I also think that it's going to have to rely on what already is there and on the care providers that are already there delivering care. We really need to think about how to reduce those frictions and get this out at scale, educate providers in their natural progression of education, get this into curriculums, get this into a broader conversation about how these therapies can be used. And think kind of zoom out and think outside of just how do we get psychedelics to people, but how do we overhaul mental health care outcomes in this country?
Perfect. Some really important questions for the entire industry to ponder there. I think now we will move on to some of the audience questions, and I'll stick with you here, Rob. The most frequently asked question that we've got so far for MindMed is in regards to the patent strategy for 18MC. I know there's been a lot of discussion on Reddit boards and elsewhere about whether or how long you guys will have exclusive access for, if you can renew a patent or what have you. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit on that.
Absolutely. I'll talk. I won't be able to say a whole lot specifically. So I think, again, to zoom out and think, we are, and everyone we hire, including on the legal and intellectual property side, comes out of pharma. And we think about this as a pharmaceutical company. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves and be saying everything we're going to do in patent strategy because it creates a competitive disadvantage. What I can say is that there are many generations of patents that get filed on new therapies. So regardless of whether we're MindMed or Novartis or Pfizer, patents are being developed and new innovations are being applied throughout the development cycle. One benefit is that the later you apply for those patents and get those patents granted, the longer exclusivity you have on the tail end. Now, I think it's the case that it's unlikely that there are going to be any, certainly on the classic psychedelics. So LSD freebase will not have a composition of matter patent because it was discovered about almost 100 years ago. The same is going to be true for psilocybin. What you're seeing are other innovations around these molecules, innovations that we are working on for 18MC, for LSD, for RMDMA, for all the other molecules that we have in the earlier pipeline. That again, we don't say specifically what they are, but there's so many layers of patents that we're pursuing and so many innovations. Our strategy is to simply be led by the intellectual property. We need to make sure that our decision makings and development are guided by what we can get patented, not just let's do this thing and hope we can get a patent for it, but let's see where the patent landscape, where does that set us in a direction, either in terms of the medicinal chemistry, the formulation work, the delivery technology. It's multifactorial. And so again, without being able to say a whole lot specifically for strategic reasons, we're very confident in our patent strategy, both now and where we're going to be going over the next several years, and that ultimately that will give us even better longevity on the back end.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Moving on to Ronan. We've got a couple questions asking for trend lines for your clinics. So I guess what people are asking is how greatly do we expect them to scale by? And then maybe also, do we expect to see them include substances like MDMA, psilocybin once those become legal?
Yeah, certainly can answer the latter question very succinctly, which is absolutely. We've designed our clinics to be able to support any approved psychedelic or legal psychedelic. And so, we have a great relationship with the team at MAPS and look forward to being able to offer MDMA-assisted therapy in our clinics, and certainly psilocybin, whether that's Compass Pathways, whether it's some of Cybin's, new versions of the molecules of DMT or psilocybin, or anything along those lines. Where our our platform from a clinical perspective will be molecule agnostic and what's going to lead to the best outcome for the specific patient. In terms of the trend lines with the clinics, I have to be conscious about what we say. I think our financials are going to be released after market today or tomorrow. I think today, actually. So I think I'll let that speak for itself in terms of growth, but we certainly anticipate there continue to be robust demand for psychedelic therapies. I don't know if anyone saw, but Roth Capital, an analyst there, put out a report where he believes that the potential market for psychedelic assisted therapies in the US alone could be worth $500 billion, making it larger than the oncology market. So there certainly seems to be robust expectations, or I'll say expectations for a robust market in this space, and we're certainly positioning ourselves to be able to be an essential part of that market.
Perfect. And then final question for you, Mr. Drysdale. People are asking about your Kernel Flow program. They just kind of want to know a little bit exactly what it is. Is it a brain-computer interface? How exactly does it work?
Yeah, that's a good question. An exciting part of our work as well as, as well as the kind of the work we're doing with our molecules to get into the clinic. It's great to be able to be doing some of this sort of groundbreaking neuroimaging work as well. So no, the Kernel Flow device is not a BCI, it's a helmet. It looks like a bicycle helmet, frankly. And it's what the Kernel team has managed to do is to take functional near-infrared spectroscopy and change it from wave light into pulse light, so it's much more intense, and pulse this light all across the cranium at 200 times a second. And then there are sensors in the helmet across the head that measure the scatter that comes back from that pulse light. And differentiating the scatter can tell you whether you're looking at bone or tissue or a blood vessel. And it's thought that by looking at changes in cranial hemodynamics, which are potentially analogous to neural activity, we can look at brain activity during a psychedelic session. And so the real advantage is this miniaturization, the portability of it. So certainly that we have access to neuroimaging technology today, like fMRI, but it's quite cumbersome and quite expensive to get access to. And also, I'd imagine, quite unpleasant to be in a metal tube with 120 decibels around your head when you're taking a psychedelic drug. So maybe not the best tool to use. So if we can deploy this on a larger scale, once we get through this first feasibility study that's about to kick off, then we should be able to collect an enormous amount of data compared to what we've been able to collect in the past. And more data means more information. So being able to look at real-time brain activity or changes in neuroplasticity before, during, and after treatment could lead to a whole range of different opportunities for drug development, whether that's more targeted treatments or treatments that keep people in a particular state for longer. So it's a bit hard to project exactly and predict exactly what we'll learn. We're at the early stages, but quite an exciting tool to be using.
So just to clarify, this is a helmet that a person would be on, and for the purpose, or have on their head rather, and for the purposes of Cybin, the main goal would be to collect as much data as possible when somebody's undergoing a psychedelic experience to help us better understand what exactly is happening in the person's brain.
Yeah, and that could lead to more quantitative data. Many of the tools we use in psychiatry are qualitative. You're asking this, and even depression scales, you're asking the patient a series of questions to determine a diagnosis. And so if we can turn that into more quantitative data, that could be useful for clinical studies in the future. If you think about lower doses of psychedelics also, where the effects are maybe less perceptual, and being able to track those quantitative changes in the brain could be valuable.
Perfect. And with that, I think we're drawing to a close, gentlemen. So I'll give you each just one last chance to discuss anything that you want to talk about on your companies, and maybe talk about what future milestones in, let's say, 2022 that you're expecting are. And we can start with you, Doug.
Sure. So one of the things we didn't talk about in terms of barriers to progress here is the misinformation and the stigmatization of psychedelics. And I think we all see a lot of psychedelic news. I suspect that the news we see is quite biased and positive. It surprises me when I talk to people outside of the sector how little they know and what their perceptions are. I'll give you an example. I was recently speaking with a scientist that gave advice to regulators, and his first reaction to psychedelics was that they are addictive and cause suicidal ideation. And it frankly scared me a little bit to think that someone in that position with that influence had such misinformation. So we're very proud today to announce a partnership with the Chopra Foundation. We're working with them and their Never Alone program initiative, and they work with policymakers and other scientist-specific groups to advance education and awareness in mental health. So part of our overall mission, as well as developing these molecules, of course, will be to help educate the general public and regulators and policymakers as we go forward.
Perfect. Robert?
Yeah, thanks so much, James, and thanks again for having us today. As we look ahead here, we are very much at an exciting time at MindMed. We have a number of phase 2 trials that are going to be getting off the ground in the early part of this year. As we progress, as we see the entire industry progress, I think the general frame here is that there's so much opportunity and there's so much unmet need that we hope all the organizations that are working on this, that Cybin and Field Trip and of course Compass and MAPS are going to see an enormous success, and we have some important industry milestones ahead, as was mentioned with MAPS getting closer and closer to filing an NDA, it looks like, and certainly Compass progressing into phase 3. So we're really excited about the opportunity we have to prove out both the classic psychedelics with LSD and generalized anxiety disorder, but also our 18MC program and opioid withdrawal, both of those studies starting this year. And then also we have a great partnership with a long-standing research group that's been working on psychedelics in Switzerland. We're going to be launching a study of the R enantiomer of MDMA and are looking to advance that in autism spectrum disorder, which would be a first-in-class treatment in autism. So we have a lot of exciting stuff ahead in 2022 and certainly 2023 and beyond. We'll have some high-impact clinical data coming out, and so excited to see increased interest in the space and increased progress.
And finally, last but not least, Mr. Levy.
Thanks, James. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak with everyone. Doug and Robert, it's great to see you again. It's been a little while. Doug and I were on the circuit about every week doing the same calls, so we've had a little bit of break, but it's good to see you again. With Field Trip, we're focused on executing our strategy, which is we hope to be in phase 1 clinical trials for FT104 sometime a little bit later this year, probably before the end of the first half of the year, and hope to have readouts as soon as possible thereafter, and then just continuing to enhance the operational effectiveness of our clinics and improve our outcomes. Those are the big drivers for this year. And then, also very significantly, we'll continue to build the picket fence around the FT200 series with our IP strategy, and hopefully have a lead candidate selected to move forward with, hopefully before the end of the year, but that's to be determined as we continue to do our chemistry work on those. So those are the targets for us, and then just to Doug's point, which is I think education and awareness amongst the medical community and the general population, I think is incredibly important. We are very much probably subjected to a fairly narrow focus of media in this industry, and it's easy to forget that the rest of the world hasn't quite caught up to where we are in understanding. So I'm really proud of the fact that Field Trip has a very significant share of voice for the overall industry and is driving that conversation across a number of spectrums from both the scientific as well as mainstream media, just getting the conversation out there, because I think that's a really important part of achieving what we all want to achieve, which is improving the mental health of the world and really making people's lives better and addressing one of the most vexing, challenging, and expensive conditions we have as a human species, which is all the mental health challenges we deal with. So it's an exciting time to be a part of this industry and create really significant impact, I believe.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. It really was an honor to speak with all of you today. Thank you for being on the show. Thank you also to Fireside Project. Hey, look, I was able to get the picture up on the screen now. They do great work as well, helping people that need help when they're currently undergoing a psychedelic experience. So once again, just thank you, all three of you. It was an absolute pleasure. I'll see you guys later.
Thank you, James. Let's see you guys.
See you, Doug.
Okay. Okay, and